I'm getting the thumbs up. Am I on? All right. I have a hard time using a microphone because, I'm used to yelling at teenagers at the high school all day, so I don't know if I'm just being super loud or if the microphone's actually picking me up sometimes. So, good evening. Getting a request to turn it up just a little bit there, Matt? Okay, so either the weather has everyone stir crazy to get out of the house, or I should have done the Edmund Fitzgerald a very long time ago. It's good to see everyone coming out. I have mixed feelings about this one. This is the one story that I promised myself I would never do. When I started doing shipwreck presentations, I promised myself I would not do the Edmund Fitzgerald because it had been done to death. There are books, there are videos, yes, there's a song. But then I made the mistake of doing a different presentation that my mom requested. And wouldn't you know, my dad wanted the Edmund Fitzgerald, so tonight I'm doing the Edmund Fitzgerald. As I like to do, I always start at the beginning because my talks are never just about the sinking of the vessel I'm talking about. So we have to go all the way back to 1958, and at the Great Lakes Engineering Works in Rouge River, Michigan, we're going to see a new freighter being built that's going to come in at 729 feet long, making it the biggest ever built on the Great Lakes. Interestingly, that ship will be named the Edmund Fitzgerald after the new board chairman of the Northwestern Mutual Life Insurance Company. Now that would seem very strange, except for two reasons. One, back in the 1950s, owning a Great Lakes freighter is a pretty lucrative investment for a corporation. And two, Mr. Fitzgerald, the person, comes from a long line of Great Lakes captains. So this is an industry he's very familiar with. So the life insurance company, they will own the Edmund Fitzgerald, and then they will charter it out to Columbia Transportation for operation. She's going to splash into the water on June 8th, 1958. Again, like I said, she will be the largest vessel to ever splash down into fresh water when she does. And there's all the fanfare that goes with the launching of a new ship. It's in the newspapers. People come out to watch. And she has a few problems when she enters the water. She actually goes too far and hits the pier on the other side of the slip. There is a rumor that one person from watching the launching, just all the excitement, actually had a heart attack and died. No one can actually verify that. But regardless, some people are thinking that maybe the ship's off to a bad start in life. September 23rd, 1958, the Edmund Fitzgerald set sail on her maiden voyage. And she's going to go up from Detroit. Here she is passing Port Huron, Michigan. She's upbound for Lake Superior, which will be her normal run for the course of her life. When she goes through the Sault, interestingly, when I dug into the Sault Ste. Marie newspapers, there was not the media coverage that you would have expected for the maiden voyage of the biggest freighter on the Great Lakes. And it even says right here, no fanfare. She just quietly goes about her trip. She's on her way to Silver Bay, Minnesota, where she's going to load a relatively new cargo in the 1950s, taconite pellets. By this point in Michigan history, we have mined out all the high-grade ore. And so what's left is low-grade ore that was not profitable to even mine for a lot of years until someone figured out how to process it, turn it into marble-sized pellets of high grade, and that was usable. So her main run is going to be from Silver Bay, Minnesota, down to the steel mills in Detroit and also Toledo. Her title as the Queen of the Lakes is going to be very short-lived. The very next year, her sister ship, the Arthur B. Homer, this is the vessel that most closely resembles the Edmund Fitzgerald, is launched in 1959. beating the Edmund Fitzgerald by 1 foot. The Fitzgerald was 729 feet. The Homer is 730, but that extra 12 inches gets her the title of Queen of the Lakes. Didn't seem to matter to the Fitz. She may not be the biggest on the lakes anymore, but she is going to set a lot of records. She was built to be a workhorse, and she's going to live up to that expectation. You can see in this headline, in 1 year, she set 5 cargo records. The first one, she's loaded 26,351 tons of taconite, or iron ore. Soon after that, she tops that one by a couple hundred more tons. Then she gets to 28,627 tons. The amount she can carry keeps going up. She gets to 29,300 tons. And then, finally, she becomes the very first vessel on the lakes ever to carry 30,000 tons in one trip. Partly why she's able to haul more and more cargo is 2 reasons. One, at this point, the lake levels were trending up, so there was more water for her to sail in, and the Coast Guard had changed her load lines. There are limitations to how deep in the water a vessel can sit, and that is established by the Coast Guard. Throughout the Fitzgerald's life, those lines were lifted. They were raised, meaning the vessel can actually sit lower in the water. So a couple of those contributing factors lead to the Fitzgerald being the first ship to hit the 1 million ton mark for one season. She's going to do that several times in her life. So she's proving to be the good investment that everyone hoped she would be. She has a relatively easy life, you might say. Not a whole lot of accidents. She is in 1 collision. But nothing really remarkable in her career as far as accidents until 1975. November 9th, 1975, she is loading in Superior, Wisconsin. And this is actually a picture that I took years ago. So you see the 3 big ore docks here. This one in the middle, she would have been loading on the opposite side of that one in this picture. And she's taking on a cargo of taconite, and she's going to depart through the Superior entry at Superior, Wisconsin. When she leaves, it's fairly warm for a November day in Minnesota or Wisconsin. Calm seas, but the forecast doesn't look too good. Not calling for a major storm, but the forecast does talk about high winds and waves getting upwards of 15 feet-ish, somewhere in there. It's a weather forecast. We always have to say ish. Other crews notice that as she's leaving, the deck crew is still out dogging down the hatch clamps and putting the last hatch covers on as she's leaving. But again, she's not departing into a storm. That's part of the story that gets misinterpreted sometimes. They did not sail out into a storm. It was calm when they left. As she leaves Superior, she's coming across Lake Superior here, and she's going to meet up with this boat, the Arthur M. Anderson, coming out of 2 harbors, also loaded with taconite. And Captain McSorley on the Fitzgerald and Captain Cooper on the Anderson, they talk over the radio, and they decide to travel down the lake together. They decide, just to be on the safe side, let's kind of hang together. And so here's where they normally would go. Okay, if you follow this green line here, on a normal trip, that's roughly the route that a downbound vessel would take on Lake Superior. The forecast is calling for northwest winds, so both captains decide to go up north. And my red line really isn't showing up very well on these big screens, but they're going to go way up here and then come back down. They're going to try to get a little bit of protection from this north shore, and then when they turn to come down toward Whitefish Point, they should, if the forecast holds, they should have the seas at their stern, or what we call following seas, trying to get the best trip that they can. And then the storm hits. And what happens next is still highly debated. You can talk to just about anybody, and they will, one, have heard of the Edmund Fitzgerald, and they will, two, have an opinion of why it's on the bottom. But there's a lot of pieces to this story. I'm going to try to walk through here what we have. At 13:50 or 1:50 in the afternoon on November 10th, Captain McSorley talks to Captain Cooper on the Anderson and says he's rolling some, meaning the ship is rolling side to side, but he's going to remain on course. It's not bad enough for him to alter course in any way. As they come further down the lake, at 3:30, he tells the Anderson, I have a fence rail down, I've lost a couple of vents, and I have a list. That's a problem, okay? These fence rails that he's talking about are actually a wire rope, if you will, I guess we can call it, and they run through metal stanchions. There's 3 strands, and they're basically to keep sailors from falling overboard. But it's a steel wire, and that is down. Now the question is, what does he mean by is it down? Did it break, or did those stanchions come loose from the deck? That's what we don't know. But it takes a significant amount of force to take one of those rails down. He's lost a couple of vents. These ships have ballast tanks, so when they're sailing empty, they have tanks that they can fill with water to help stabilize the ship in waves. And there are vents at the top, so as they fill it, the air can come out. He's lost a couple of those vents, which means there's an open hole in the deck. And at this point, he is in the storm. Seas are at least at the 15-foot mark that was forecasted, maybe a bit higher at this point. Winds are getting up there around 50 miles an hour. He has waves washing over his deck. He has a hole. Water's getting into those ballast tanks when he doesn't want it there. And he has a list. So his ship is tipping to one side for some reason. Later on, it's come to be said that he had a starboard list. Interestingly, when I went back through my research, when you read all the reports, no one ever says it's a starboard list. That actually gets put in an interview later, years later, by Captain Cooper on the Anderson that was following the Fitzgerald. But at the time, no one actually ever said, and McSorley never said it was a starboard list, but he was listing in some direction. He tells the Anderson, he tells Captain Cooper, I'm going to check down, or I'm going to slow down so you can catch up. By this point, the Fitzgerald was the faster boat, and he had pulled away from the Anderson. He says, I'm going to slow down so you can catch up to me. I would kind of like you to be closer to me than you are right now. And Captain Cooper asks him, okay, you have a list. Do you have your pumps going? And McSorley has a really interesting reply. He says, yes, both of them. Well, the Fitzgerald had 2 pumps that worked the ballast tanks. He had 4 pumps that were bigger pumps that could clear water out of the rest of the ship. So he has 6 pumps total. Some of them can pump 10,000 gallons of water a minute. What does he mean by both of them? He never elaborated. Then things get a little bit worse. Okay, at 4:10 in the afternoon, Captain McSorley tells the Anderson he has lost his radar. The Fitzgerald had 2 radar units on top of the pilot house, and they are both now inoperative. He's now in about 20-foot seas, and he can't tell where he's going. It's raining, it's snowing, visibility is very low, and both of his radars are out. Whether it was the wind, whether it was waves washing over the pilot house, and that is a possibility. Other ships reported waves tall enough to go over their pilot house. The Anderson was actually damaged in the storm. Came out later. The Anderson had one of its lifeboats damaged when a wave boarded the stern and hit the lifeboat 30 feet above the waterline. So it could have been a wave. We don't know, but something took out the radars. He asked the Anderson to give him radar position fixes. Tell me where I am. Because he's also coming into this area where there's some islands. This is not completely open lake. He needs to know where he is on the water. And so the Anderson's going to be helping him navigate. At 4:39, the Coast Guard responds to McSorley's inquiry about the Whitefish Point radio beacon. Most people know about Whitefish Point Lighthouse. There's also a radio beacon up there. And he's trying to find that on his radio direction finder. Okay? That's some technology from the 70s where they could actually use a radio beacon to navigate their vessel. And he's not picking it up. And at this point on the lake, he should be getting that radio beacon, and he's not. And so he sends out a radio call to the Coast Guard saying, what's the story here? What's going on? And the Coast Guard says, we can't get it either. So for some reason, that radio beacon is down. At some point between 1700 and 1730, he actually talks to a Great Lakes pilot aboard an ocean-going ship called the Avafors. And at that point, the pilot on the Avafors knew Captain McSorley. And the radio call was, any ship in the vicinity of Whitefish Point, are you getting the radio beacon or can you see the lighthouse? And he responds and says, yes, the light is on, the radio beacon is not. And he asked who he was talking to. And he knew Captain McSorley. And he was shocked to find out that he was talking to the guy he knew. He said later, it didn't sound like McSorley. The guy was clearly highly stressed. And in the middle of this conversation, he hears McSorley yell, "Don't let nobody on deck." I won't talk about the grammar there, even though my mom, the author, is here. I like to remind her that when you're quoting someone, even if it's bad grammar, you still have to say it. That is quite the statement from McSorley. In weather like this, you don't let people out on deck. That's an automatic. No one in their right mind would want to go out on deck in this. At this point, ships like the Fitzgerald, similar in size to the Anderson, they have waves coming over their deck up to there's 10 to 12 feet of water above their deck. They're reporting their hatch cranes, the big machine that takes the hatch covers off, being buried by waves. So you have waves 10 to 12 feet high on top of the deck. No one in their right mind's going out in that. So why is the captain having to yell and tell people not to go out there? Something's wrong, but he doesn't say what. He does tell the Avafors, I have a bad list, I have lost both radars, and I'm taking heavy seas over the deck. So that list has now become a bad list, according to the man in charge. But that's all we know. At 19:10, 7:10 in the evening, the Anderson calls Fitzgerald. There's a little bit of conversation. They want to let McSorley know there are 3 saltwater vessels or ocean-going vessels upbound. And he says, well, am I going to clear? Yep, they're further away from you. They're not on the same track line. You're safe, okay? And he's actually talking to second mate Morgan Clark at the time, not Captain Cooper. And Clark asked him, by the way, how are you making out with your problems? They've been talking back and forth for hours now. And McSorley issues the infamous line, we are holding our own. And that's it. No further details. Okay, talk to you later. Hang up the phone. Ten minutes later, the Fitzgerald cannot be seen on the Anderson's radar screen. When they went back to the radar screen, they wanted to get another fix on him, and he wasn't there. They weren't overly concerned at the moment because there was a snow squall setting in there, and with the waves, you're up to 20, even 25-foot seas at this point. They're getting a lot of sea return in the radar. The Fitzgerald had sailed into that sea return blob on the screen, but he's not there. Captain Cooper now has to try to figure out what's going on and what are his next steps going to be. When he realizes the Fitzgerald is not on his radar screen, he grabs the radio, he tries to call Captain McSorley again. He has no success. Okay, well maybe his radio is out. A very common thing that can happen in a storm. A lot of ships, there are a lot of stories of ships that have had their radio antennas damaged in a storm. No one can get in touch with them, and they're found days later just fine. But to be safe, he contacts the Coast Guard in Sault Ste. Marie on the emergency channel, Channel 16. He wants to tell him there's potentially a problem. And the Coast Guard tells him to switch to channel 12. He does. He tries to raise the Coast Guard, and there's no reply. He can't raise them on channel 12. At 8 o'clock at night, he contacts the upbound ocean-going vessels. Have you seen the Fitzgerald? No, we have not. Now Cooper knows there's probably something seriously wrong because he can see those ships' lights in his wheelhouse windows. When he looks out over Lake Superior, even in the snow and the dark, he can see those ships' lights. So if the Fitzgerald, who's supposed to be between him and those ships he can see, and he can't see the Fitz, there's a problem. Now, maybe he had a power outage. Maybe his lights are out. So the guys in the Andersons' wheelhouse start looking. They grab binoculars, they start looking. At one point, the wheelsman thought he saw a white light. No one else could see it. And eventually, he couldn't either. Captain Cooper calls the Coast Guard one more time. He wants to tell them there's potentially a problem. And this time, he's told to look out for a missing 16-foot fishing boat. At 8:30, Cooper's had enough. He calls the Coast Guard again, and this time, very forcefully, he says, I am very concerned about the welfare of the steamer Edmund Fitzgerald. He's done asking nicely. He's called him twice, and the first time they ignored him or forgot to get back with him. The second time, they asked him to look for a fishing boat. This time, he's done asking nicely. He says, you have a missing 729-foot ore carrier. What are you going to do about it? Here's what they're going to do about it. The Coast Guard, initially, is going to try calling, well, the Anderson calls at 2103. Again, calls them back again and says, I'm officially telling you this boat is missing. We're done with there's a problem, I can't find him. I am officially telling you this thing is missing. So after that call, the Coast Guard watchstander in the Sioux tries to call the Edmund Fitzgerald on the radio. Like Cooper hasn't told him that he's not answering the radio, right? This is kind of like when you call IT and they tell you, did you try rebooting the computer? I'm sure Captain Cooper tried calling a few times. But they tried calling the Fitz again, no answer. So, at 9 o'clock at night, the Coast Guard asked the Anderson to depart Whitefish Bay. By this point, Captain Cooper has brought his ship safely into Whitefish Bay, and he's at anchor. He's gotten out of the storm. He's in the lee of Whitefish Point, and the Coast Guard calls him and asks him if he will return to the scene and look for the Fitz. Because, to put it bluntly, the Coast Guard can't handle the job. They do not have the resources in place in that part of the lake to be able to withstand those types of conditions. Their best hope is to ask merchant vessel captains to go out and look. I love this part. They call Cooper and ask him if he could go back and do any searching. And Captain Cooper, who was a lifetime sailor, he started as a deckhand. He worked his way up through the ranks. He's been out there for years. He's seen it all. And his first response to the Coast Guard is, do you realize what the conditions are out there? Do you know what you're asking me to do? You can go on YouTube. That audio is on YouTube. And the amazement in his voice. Do you understand what the first time he says, do you realize what the conditions are? The Coast Guard doesn't answer. He has to ask a second time. I said, do you realize what the conditions are? Do you know what you are asking me to do? And the Coast Guard commander goes, well, yeah, I have to leave it up to you as to whether or not you're hazarding your vessel, but it'd be really nice if you'd go back and look. And Cooper, in a later interview, even admitted, I didn't want to go. But he said, they said there's a ship on the bottom. He said he wanted to tell them there could be two if I go back. But ultimately, he said, if it was me, I would want someone to come out and come looking. So he told the crew that they were going to go back, and they had a new guy. They had a brand new sailor on board, and apparently he had spent several days telling everyone how he wanted to see real weather. Wish granted. Story goes, when he got the word they were going back out into that storm, he went down to his cabin. He got a tape recorder. He recorded his last will and testament, put it in a bottle, and threw it overboard. But away they went. Here's what the Coast Guard has available. Okay, again, we're talking right here, slightly off Whitefish Point. At 21:15, the Coast Guard Air Station in Traverse City starts sending out helicopters and other aircraft loaded with flares to help search. And there was a delay in that because they were supposed to have aircraft loaded with flares ready to go at a moment's notice. Guess what? They didn't have the flares loaded on board. So there was a 30-minute delay getting those aircraft off the ground. At 21:25, the Coast Guard cutter Naugatuck is ordered to get underway from Sault Ste. Marie. She had actually been in the Sioux to get repairs. They were having some oil line problems. But given the conditions, she's not allowed to go past Whitefish Point. She's a smaller cutter. She can't handle 25-foot seas. So at 21:30, they call the Wood Rush all the way across the lake in Duluth and say, we need you to get underway. And so they get the crew back together, and they're going to cross the lake and go searching. And it's quite a trip. The Wood Rush is registering some serious rolls. At one point, the captain said he looked over and his first officer was standing on a wall, not the floor of the boat. They asked for more help. So there are already other ships anchored in Whitefish Bay. And the Coast Guard starts calling them and says, we have a ship that's missing. Will you go help look? Two of them say, we'll go. The William Clay Ford and the Hilda Marjan. They both say, we'll go. They pick up anchor, and they're going to head out with the Anderson. The Hilda Marjan, this one on the bottom here, is going to be forced to turn back. He's going to get close enough to Whitefish Point, and he finally turns around and says, I can't make it. So you're going to have two ore boats go out looking for the Fitz, the Anderson and the William Clay Ford. You know me, I love the ironies of history. So, back to the Fitzgerald's maiden voyage for a second. Her first trip through the locks, she's listed right here, upbound, okay? September 23rd, right here, 2:20 in the afternoon, upbound. When I dug this up on the microfilm, what I noticed is downbound in the morning, at 4:50 in the morning, is the Arthur M. Anderson. The ship that was following it the night it sank, they would have met in northern Lake Huron on its maiden voyage. Downbound in the afternoon at 3:10, the William Clay Ford. They would have passed somewhere off of Brimley State Park, somewhere out there. So the two vessels that are going to go looking for her when she sinks met her on her maiden trip in 1958. Another interesting side note, the Fitzgerald was built at the Great Lakes Engineering Works in Detroit. She was hull number 301. Hull number 300, the one that was built just prior to her, was the William Clay Ford. So word starts getting out that there's a missing ore ship. And the storm is not helping the search at all. But everyone's doing what they can. As the storm starts to subside over the next couple of days, more ships join in the search. Eventually, you have Coast Guard aircraft, you have the Wood Rush, and you have a miniature fleet of merchant vessels out there looking for anything that they can find. They find the inflatable life raft and the Fitzgerald's lifeboats. Everyone has probably seen the pictures of the lifeboats. The one is completely ripped in half. It really speaks to exactly how much destruction happened to that ship when it went down. A lot of people don't realize she had self-inflating life rafts. These things were designed, if the ship were to sink, this thing was supposed to self-inflate when it hit the water. Or the crew could have manually inflated it, got in it, and let it float off the ship as it went down. It's empty. How is a life-saving device that's designed to be used on quick notice empty? Doesn't take but a couple of days, and they find what they are pretty sure is the wreck site. They send a P-3 Orion up with a special magnetometer, and on the first pass, the needle on that magnetometer went all the way to the right. They found a giant steel target. And so they put a special sonar on the Woodrush to go see if they can verify that it is indeed a shipwreck. As with any sinking, there has to be a Coast Guard inquiry. And now, in this particular case, the Coast Guard is up against it. They have no idea what happened to the ship, and there's no survivors. There was no Mayday call. There was nothing in the conversations with the Anderson to give a clue as to what possibly could have happened. So they are starting with literally no information. And they are tasked with giving an answer. Why did a 729-foot ship sink without so much as a call for help? So they're going to start their probe. They're going to talk to everyone they can find. They talk to company officials. They talk to the officers of the Anderson. They talk to former sailors of the Fitzgerald. They talk to the ship's cook. They talk to relief sailors that were on her for a month. Anyone they can think of. And pretty much what they come up with is, McSorley was a good guy, he was a good captain, it was a great ship. Well, that doesn't give you too many answers. Eventually they have to take a break because it's December, it's Lake Superior. They still have not actually put eyes on the wreck site. They have no physical evidence. All they have is testimony. So they're going to halt their inquiry until May of 1976 when they get this thing. This is the Curve 3 unit. Curve means cable-controlled underwater recovery vehicle. When we lost an H-bomb off the coast of Spain several years prior to the Fitzgerald going down, this is the machine that got it back. This is the best piece of technology they could get at the time. And it has video camera, it has still cameras, and they're going to go get pictures of this wreck site. They still don't know for a fact that it's the Fitzgerald. They just know something's down there. So they're going to go take a look. And here's just a little diagram of how this works. So they're going to send the Woodrush back out, and they put these mooring buoys out here, and they're going to lower the curve down here down to the wreck site. And interestingly, they get back out there, and Lake Superior wasn't quite ready to give up her answers yet. Another storm comes in, and it starts moving the Woodrush around, and it actually pulled one of these mooring buoys. The stress of the movement of the ship actually pulled one of these buoys so far underwater that it imploded the buoy. And this is a steel buoy, and it just crushed it like an eggshell. When they get down there, it doesn't take long, and the video cameras start sending back pictures, and they can put the letters together, and now they know it is, in fact, the Fitzgerald. They know they're looking at the right wreck. Which leaves the big question, why? They're out there for days. They compile hours and hours of videotape, thousands and thousands of still photographs. And now they're going to go back, they're going to piece it all together, and they're going to try to come up with an answer, why? To this day, there are 4 main theories of why the Fitzgerald went down. What the Coast Guard came up with is the problem lies with these things, these C-clamp looking things. These are the clamps that dog the hatch covers down. These are supposed to be tightened, and they kind of hinge down here at the bottom. You can see how these ones are kind of open, or they hinge down, and that hinge locks back down to tighten it. And what the Coast Guard came up with is that when they looked at the wreck footage, they noticed that a lot of those clamps were not damaged. Now, the hatch covers are almost all off the ship. They've all been blown off the ship. Well, if you have a 7-ton sheet of steel getting blown off the ship, it should damage the hatch clamps that were holding it in place. Some are. Many are not. And so they said, we don't think all of those clamps were actually in place when she went down. That they probably did not actually dog down all of the clamps. In summertime, that is normal. We don't dog down all the clamps. And that's what you see going on in this picture. About every third or fourth one is actually clamped down. The rest are just open. But with a storm forecasted and in November, they should have all been clamped down. So they say that since all the clamps were not dogged down, those covers actually sit on a rubber gasket. And so when you clamp it down, it compresses that rubber gasket and creates a seal. And what the Coast Guard said is, since all the clamps weren't dogged down, you didn't get that seal. And with all those waves washing over the deck, you had water leaking into the cargo hold with every single wave. And that boat just slowly got lower and lower and lower in the water until finally she just nosedived. The NTSB took a look at all the evidence as well in their own investigation, and they said, close, Coast Guard, but not quite. They noticed that the number 1 hatch, the one most forward, right up here, is actually caved into the cargo hold. And what they said is, you're close, it does have to deal with the hatches, but the NTSB said, no, it's not from a leak. What happened is you had waves pile up on the bow, so they rolled up the deck and they got stopped by this forward cabin area, and the weight of that water collapsed the forward 2 or 3 hatch covers. And with that much water pouring into these massive cover roll hatches that are open, the boat just took a nosedive. The shipping company said, no way. We have been using these types of hatches for years. We have never had a problem. The Fitzgerald had never delivered what we call a wet cargo, so she sailed through a lot of storms. When the Coast Guard went back through the records, they found that McSorley actually sailed through the most storms of any captain in 1975. He didn't lay up for anything. And the shipping company said, sailing through all that weather, he's had water on his deck before. They would have opened those hatches and they would have found a wet cargo at some point if there was a leak problem. What the shipping company proposed is that they said, you know what, there's a shoal area north of Caribou Island, kind of right by where he was going. We think he hit bottom. He punched a hole in the bottom of the boat and eventually just took on enough water that he nosedived. Nobody's fault, complete accident. Works out really well for the shipping company because now they're not liable for anything. Other people, when they looked at the wreck is in 2 pieces. You have the bow section that's upright and the stern section that's upside down. Other people said, you know, that it's in 2 pieces. That is eerily similar to the Carl D. Bradley and the Daniel J. Morrell that we know split in half. So some people say that she just broke in 2, like this boat is doing in this picture. Some people think that the Fitz just finally, through a structural failure, completely split in 2 on the surface and went down. Those are the 4 main theories that if you talk to anyone today, they're probably going to give you one of those 4. There are some people that say that actually the crew was abducted by aliens, but we won't go there. Then come more expeditions, because we as human beings have to know. Those reports, those investigations did not really give us answers. They gave us ideas. And you're not going to keep people away from a mystery for long. And in 1980, the world's most famous diver, Jacques Cousteau, is going to come up and visit the Fitzgerald. Unfortunately, not him in person. He sends his son in charge of his boat and his 2-man submersible. And they're going to go down, they're going to take a look at the shipwreck. And Cousteau's team, they must be really good, because they figured out exactly what happened to the Fitz in a 30-minute dive to the bow. The Coast Guard said maybe this is what happened. After months of investigation, Cousteau's team figured it out in 30 minutes. They said that it split in half on the surface and sank. And that was it. 1989, the Great Lakes Shipwreck Historical Society says it's time to go take a really good look at this wreck. Yes, the Coast Guard did the best they could, but let's face it, that was 1976. Underwater technology by 1989 has vastly improved. We can get a lot better images now. And so they're going to go down and take a look with their own ROV and see if they can figure out what's going on, why did it sink, and they came back and said, okay, maybe the Coast Guard was right, we don't know. Fast forward to 1994. The Fitzgerald will actually be visited twice in the same month. The first crew goes out. They are associated with Harbor Branch Oceanographic and the Great Lakes Shipwreck Historical Society. They go out with a submarine this time. They said, you know what, the ROV is cool, but let's put our own eyeballs on it. They go down in a submarine, and they find some interesting things. For example, if I can back this up, this is the port side pilot house door. It's open. Now, doors can be blown open in a sinking. It's not. It's dogged open. It's locked in the open position. Given the route the Fitzgerald was sailing the night it went down, this would have been the door that would have been on the windward side of the ship. You would have had the wind and rain and snow blowing in this door. Why is it locked open? They were able to look in the pilot house windows. Remember when I said that McSorley said he was slowing the ship down to let the Anderson catch up? Well, the engine order telegraph in the pilot house reads full ahead. He sped up at some point, never told anyone. And right up until the sinking, Cooper testified that the Anderson was still catching up to the Fitz. So he's the faster boat. He's going at full speed, and the slower ship is catching up to him. They did learn some things in 1994. And what they find in 94 leads them to believe that the ship actually just did a nosedive. It was clearly damaged before it sank. That much is evident. But what they decide is the Fitz probably just drove itself to the bottom almost like a submarine, because when they got around the point of the bow, looking at the draft markings on the bow, that ship is buried 29 feet into the bottom mud. And when we look at the wrecks like the Bradley and the Morel, that we know for a fact split on the surface, they're not buried in the mud like that. So they think that the Fitz kind of slowly flooded for whatever reason until she just lost buoyancy, dove into a wave, and then the force of its own propeller even drove it into the bottom. And then this guy, Fred Shannon. He's from Flint. He is all about the Edmund Fitzgerald, and he mounts his own private expedition in the same month, July of 1994. He's going to go look at the wreck. And everyone was really impressed because he had saved up $75,000 to build his wife her dream home, and instead he spent it on a shipwreck dive. And she went on the expedition too. But he is going to go take a look at the Fitzgerald for the second time in the same month. His theory, he agrees with Cousteau. He says, I think it split on the surface and went down. That's all well and good. That's been already covered by Cousteau. No big breaking news here. That's not what Fred Shannon's expedition is known for. On the second to last dive of their expedition, they go down with a submarine, not an ROV. When they come back to the surface, they have something that no one else has found. They found one of the crewmen. And up until now, until 1994, the story was she went down with all hands, no survivors, no bodies recovered. They found one of them. It's laying on the bottom outside of the ship, off the port bow. There is one of the men in a life jacket laying on the bottom. That changes the story a little bit. He has a life jacket on. Why? The pilot house door is dogged open. This guy's in a life jacket. They obviously knew they were in trouble. That discovery leads to some problems. Fred Shannon announces that he is going to publish a book and a documentary about the Edmund Fitzgerald, and he announces that he is going to use the footage and the photos of the body. And people do not like that. This goes all the way through the state legislature. No one likes this. They say he's desecrating a grave site. One of the lost crewmen's family members said, "Personally, I feel the man is morally bankrupt." Someone else said, "I can't believe he's doing this to us. That is my dad's grave, and it should be respected." So now the talk starts going, how much more exploration do we allow? How many more times do we let someone come start poking their eyes around the shipwreck? Because you know what? Technology is always getting better. If they found one of them, they'll find the others. The families start pushing for a law to declare the wreck site off limits. You cannot go visit the Edmund Fitzgerald. And unfortunately, or I shouldn't say unfortunately, but for them, they have to go through the Canadian government because the Fitzgerald lies on the Canadian side of the lake, barely. That turns into its own legal battle. When that starts happening in 1995, Fred Shannon sues. And he says, "You can't do that. This is basically what he says, this is public property. This is public domain. It is on the bottom of a public lake. And you can't declare this wreck site off limits." And on a personal note, my documentary and video will be worth as much if other people can't go explore it. A judge says, no, that's not going to work like that. He also tries to claim that the international boundary actually goes between the two parts of the shipwreck. He actually claims the stern section's on the Canadian side. Yeah, that's true, but the bow section's on the American side. And it is that close. For a little while, people thought that may be true, but then with better technology, GPS becomes more fine-tuned. They actually do prove that it is completely on the Canadian side by a few hundred yards. So his lawsuit gets thrown out, and so the Canadian government appears to be very favorable to declaring the wreck site off limits, but the families have one more request. They'd like the bell. They would like a memorial for their family members. And so there's one more expedition in 1995 where they send this guy down with this yellow suit. Basically, it's a personalized submarine is what this is. It's called the Newt suit. And so this guy goes down, and there's a cutting torch attached to this suit. He's going to go down 535 feet and cut this bell off the top of the Fitzgerald pilot house, which caused its own problems. In normal circumstances, if you're cutting something underwater, all the gas and everything just goes to the surface. This guy is running a cutting torch, and all the gases are actually being caught underneath the bell. And if a spark had gone up there, yes, you can have an explosion underwater. He's essentially cutting on a bomb. No one thought about that at the time until he was already down there cutting. They do get the bell off the wreck. They bring it up. They bring it to Sault Ste. Marie. There's a memorial service right there by the side of the river. It goes to Michigan State University for restoration. And now she's on permanent display at the museum at Whitefish Point, and you can go see her there. They ring that bell every November 10th up there for the 29 men. It is the one time a year that this bell actually rings. The rest of the time, she is under protective fiberglass casing. As long as they were down there, they knew this was going to be the last trip to the wreck site. And so this guy in this Newt suit gets a first-hand look at the wreck site. He's actually able to motor all the way around and go take a look at everything. And again, it's 1995 now, technology's better, and they start realizing just how damaged the ship is. there are steel plates in the side of the hull that are actually blown out from the force of the impact, from the force of air coming out of the ship as it hit the bottom. But it turns out he's not the last one to visit the Fitzgerald. Before the law could actually take effect, 2 guys managed to scuba dive it. Scuba technology had gotten far enough that 2 guys could actually scuba dive 535 feet. So 2 guys actually go down there, and they grabbed the pilot house railing. They were down there for like 2 minutes, I think it was, and it took them 4 hours of decompression on the way back up. They were the last ones to visit the Fitz. And so the legend lives on, thanks to Mr. Lightfoot. Usually, I like to give you answers at the end of my presentations. With this particular wreck, I can't. No matter how you look at that wreck site, something doesn't add up. You can apply any of the theories to the evidence, and something doesn't make sense. If it broke apart on the surface, why is it plowed into the mud the way it is? If you take the 2 halves of the ship and add them together, you come up missing 200 feet of the middle. It's been obliterated. It's shredded all across the lake bottom. That doesn't typically happen on a wreck that splits up. You want to look at the leaking hatch covers. Okay? Why a list? If you take in water into the cargo hold, that's still in the center of the ship, and it's loaded. It's loaded with iron ore pellets, which is a very dense cargo, so you're not going to have water sloshing side to side. Water had to be getting in somewhere that caused a list. Maybe the hatch covers imploded, like the NTSB said. Only hatch number 1 is inside the cargo hold. Hatches 2 and 3, like they talked about, are actually bent outward. They're laying on the bottom by the stern. Well, if they imploded, they wouldn't have been thrown out as it went down. Maybe it touched bottom. When they looked at the wreck, they looked at the track line the Fitz was on. The shoal area that they tried to claim it may have hit is way too far away from where the wreck site is. The Fitz would have had to make a huge detour to hit that shoal, and probably would have gone aground on Caribou Island, to be honest with you, if she had gone that far off track. None of the theories totally stack up with the evidence. There's evidence to support them all. There's evidence to discredit them all. And so, yeah, Gordon Lightfoot was right. The legend is going to live on because we probably will never know exactly why it went down. And that's why you're here listening to me talk about it tonight, because we want to know. Sorry to disappoint you, but I can't tell you why. That is all I have. Any questions? Did I totally confuse anyone?
Early on in the presentation, you talked about how they get raised lines for the product. Is that a normal thing, or why would they have done that?
Why did they raise the load lines? Because at the time they raised those load lines, that was really in the 60s that they did that. The load level limits were really antiquated. They had been drawn up by when ships had wooden hatch covers and wooden doors, and so they had to have more freeboard to keep the force of the waves off the ship. And the Coast Guard said, well, we now have steel hatch covers, we have steel doors, we can button a ship up really good. And so they said they can carry more cargo. Yep. Yeah. Yeah, it was. And I went to college in the Sioux, and my advisor was up there during that storm, and I remember him telling me, if you've ever been to the Sioux Locks, they go parallel with Portage Street, which is quite a distance back from the river. And I remember him telling me that Portage Street was flooded a foot deep in water that had come over the edge of the locks. They actually closed the locks down, which almost never happens in any weather. The Homer is not still sailing. A couple years after this, they actually lengthened the Arthur B. Homer. That was a common thing that happened to a lot. Actually, at the time the Fitzgerald went down, the Anderson was bigger than the Fitz. She had been lengthened earlier. And they lengthened the Homer. She sailed a couple more years, and then she was scrapped. She really didn't sail much longer after that, and people kind of wonder why. She just kind of went away. There were some questions about some maybe possible design flaws or things like that, but they did lengthen the Homer, and I think it was maybe a season or two, and then she was done.
The Anderson's still sailing. It's pretty special every time you see her.
The Anderson is still sailing. Yep, the Anderson is still sailing, and I had a really funny story from this fall. So in the summertime when I'm, not trying to teach high schoolers, I go out and I play sailor for a couple of weeks. And a guy that was my first mate, he finished up the year on the Anderson, and he posted a video. They're downbound on Lake Huron early January, and what comes on the radio in the pilot house? But Gordon Lightfoot. And he took a video of it, and he posted it on Facebook, and I was like, hey, Bart, sleep with the door open. That's not a good sign. Anybody else? Yeah.
There was a picture, Jeff, of the Fitzgerald, and you said it was loading. That part where with rudder was still out of the water. Is that normal?
I don't know what picture exactly.
Pretty rare first picture.
Yeah, you can still see the top of the rudder usually on those ships, unless they are really, really loaded. But just the design with that curved stern, usually you can still see the very top of it. Yeah.
Kind of talk about a picture of exterior entry.
Oh, okay, yeah. So in that particular picture, that wasn't from when she left that night or that day, but in ships with that design, you do see the top of the rudder even loaded. Yeah.
Jeff, did you read of anything in your studies regarding the legal and financial implications of, you mentioned the insurance company owning it and the joys of liability and its impact. Have you read anything of that?
Yeah, so when it went down, I assume you're talking about when it went down and the insurance payout, Northwest Mutual actually, in the charter contract, stipulated somebody else is going to insure this boat. So they got a payment, I believe it came from Columbia Transportation. They got a payment for the loss of the ship. And then Columbia would have gotten the insurance money from the sinking, from the insurance company. But the insurance company that owned it did not insure it. That was stipulated in the contract.
Are the sailors' families given anything? Is that typical, or how does that?
Yeah, so that always comes down to a settlement because there's a lot of factors to that as far as money for the family members. And this is why what caused it to go down was such a big deal. Because if a company is found liable, if the ship was not in good repair, if the hatch covers were leaking or the hatch clamps were damaged, they are liable for as much as they can be sued for. If it is navigational error by the men on board, they're not as liable for as much. And then if it is what is officially termed an act of God, meaning the storm just overwhelmed the ship, the company is only liable for for the value of the ship and its cargo would have been had they finished the trip. And so there was a settlement. I don't know the exact payouts, but there was a settlement Of course, when all the lawsuits come in, the numbers are astronomical, and then the company will always come back with a very low offer, and they usually settle for somewhere in the middle. But the families did finally get some, but it took a lot of legal wrangling. Yes, I did get to ring the bell once. I did my senior thesis in college on the Fitzgerald. I would like to say that it's because of my deep passion for Great Lakes history. The truth is, I was a senior in college. I'm in Sault Ste. Marie. What is the easiest thing to research as a history major in the Sioux? I'm in year 5 of college. I don't want to work that hard, so I did the easy topic. But I did get to meet the people at the Great Lake Shipwreck Historical Society. That's where I got some of the wreck pictures that I had in here tonight. They gave those to me for my use. And they called me up the next November, and they're like, hey, we want to know if you want to come out, maybe be a bell ringer at the ceremony. I'm like, yeah, let me think about this for half a second. Yeah. And it happened to be the 35th anniversary of the sinking, so we had a lot of the family members came out to Whitefish Point that year. And it was a Wednesday night, so I had to go. I had a class Wednesday night, so I had to go to my professor and say, hey, look, I know we have class, but I got asked to ring the Fitzgerald's bell out of Whitefish Point. She didn't even let me finish my sentence. She was like, you go. She goes, if you were in my class tomorrow night, I will be mad at you. You go. But so, yeah, I did get to ring the bell once. That was pretty cool. Any other questions? Yeah.
How are the families, how are they dealing with that? Obviously, the closer the family, they're going to have a hard time, but at this point, is it a matter of fact, or are they still really struggling?
Well, to be totally honest, in 2023, we are really getting down to the children are the closest living relatives now, for the most part. Not completely yet, but I'm sure it's like any other loss in the family. It never really goes away, especially with not having anyone to bury. There is a History Channel show where the one lady likens it to losing someone on 9/11, where there's no closure. You don't get that funeral at the end to say goodbye. But as time passes, they dealt with it. I got to talk to a couple of them briefly. 35 years later, it was a very somber ceremony, to be sure, but it was more just a remembrance for them at that point. Was my take on it. Yeah. Anybody else? Yeah.
You said that one of the dives there, they found the body. Did they actually bring the body up?
They did not. That was left alone. Not that I'm aware of. They found one. Trying to recover the body from that depth after that much time just was not practical. So he's still down there. Yeah. Anybody else? Yeah. It's just GPS. It actually is marked on, like when ships sail over top of it, it's actually marked Edmund Fitzgerald. It's the only, as far as I know, the only wreck site that's marked by name. But it's out there at a point where you really can't get at it without someone spotting you, because you're not that far away from the shipping lanes, but there's not a buoy or anything on it as far as I know. Yeah, so they brought the original bell up, and they did replace it with a replica bell that had the name of the lost crew inscribed on it. So there's not an empty spot on the top of the pilot house. They did get their headstone. That's true. Anything else?
We've sailed right over it. It's really weird.
Is it?
No, it's right down there below you.
It would have to be. And hopefully, God willing, that's the last, I won't have a more recent one to tell you about after this. Hopefully she's the last one, but there's been a few scary stories out there, but we've kept them all up so far. So, anybody else? I'm a lightweight sailor, so I go out in July and August when it's calm. I leave the heavy weather for the real sailors. I just go out, pretend like I'm cool for a couple weeks, and then I come home. I haven't, I think about the highest I've been in is about 8 feet, something like that. About 8 feet. You don't generally get a lot of big storms in July and August, so, but we had a couple. You know, when I got off the boat last summer, we had a thunderstorm roll through at Cedarville, so going through the straits, we were bouncing off walls a little bit, but yeah. When things get rough, I leave it to the real sailors. I go home. I go back to my classroom and pretend like I'm cool. The Joseph L. Block is the one I'm usually on. Yep. Well, my standard answer to that is I row. No, I'm a deckhand, what they call an OS, ordinary seaman. So I wash the boat and I paint the boat. That's and somewhere in between, I also help tie it up at the docks and when we go through the locks. But my big thing is I take those hatch covers on and off. I rinse the cargo holds. I rinse the deck. I tie the boat up. And when there's nothing else to do, I grab a paintbrush. Yes, we swab too. Because, yeah, the cabin area needs to be clean. So, yes, I'm very good with a paint roller and a mop at this point.
Is that true, Kay? I wouldn't know.
And you eat well.
And we eat well, yes. Anybody else? Yeah.
You might want to include in your talk the Woodridge, the Coast Guard buoy tender that went out there, was only 180 feet long.
Yeah, so this storm that took down a 729-footer, these guys are going out in a 180-foot boat, and it did. It rolled. Yeah, that was in an interview. He told the inquiry, too, the captain of the Woodrush. He actually looked over, and they rolled so far that his first officer was standing on the wall, not the floor. And in the interview was with a guy that was on the inquiry board, and he asked the captain, well, what'd you do after that? And the captain said, I went below and changed my skivvies, is what I did. Anybody else? Well, hey, thanks for coming out, and hope to maybe talk to you but a little bit later, but thanks.